So, what is inflation? Coming right on. What's up, y'all? Welcome back to Common Sense Logic and Reason. And as always, I'm going to say thank y'all for joining me today. So, my channel, as I said, my channel is all about, it's a channel all about dealing with the issues with blacks in America and dealing with all of the problems, addressing the problems, speaking the truth on what's really wrong with black America and why black America has been failing, what's wrong with the black family and how the black family got in the shape it was from the 1960s to where it is now. And again, most of my content I get from dealing with black people and identifying these issues with black folks. Again, the issues that I've been seeing all of my life. And I've been seeing it for 50 years. So there's a lot of content on what's wrong with black people. A lot of content. And oftentimes I also watch other content creators, and I will see people say things and I know that they don't have an understanding of something. And there's one thing that I just recently saw not too long ago that I know that so many people just don't have a clear understanding of, and that's inflation. Most people know that if inflation exists, we hear it all the time, especially with this current election cycle that we have coming. We have talked about inflation like there's no tomorrow. Most people know that it exists. We hear about it. I don't think most people really know what inflation really is, though, and that's why my whole purpose of making this video. And again, this is going to be a two-part video, and trying to understand money and how the government the government interacts with the money, how they get the money. But in this video, I'm going to deal with inflation and what inflation is. Now, most people, if you ask them what inflation is, they'll just say when prices go up. Well, that's not really what inflation is. Now, I will say that inflation causes prices to go up, but prices going up is not necessarily inflation. Essentially, what inflation is, and like I said, it's not very difficult to understand. It's just simply when we have an increase in the money supply. When the Federal Reserve increases the money supply. Now, what do I mean by increasing the money supply? Well, let's say that, there's a total of $5 trillion worth of dollars circulating all throughout the world that's in existence. There are $5 trillion in existence, right? And the Federal Reserve, next year, the Federal Reserve creates $1 trillion out of nowhere and adding it to circulation. Well, then we'll have $6 trillion in circulation. That's essentially what the inflation is when you increase the money supply. Now, the problem with increasing the money supply and where we come with making prices go up is that every time you increase the money supply, you create abundance, and just the law of supply and demand. The more something that you have, the less it's going to be worth. The less of something that you have, the more it's going to be worth. But when they increase the money supply, when the Federal Reserve, which is a private organization, mind you, increases the money supply and add money to circulation, money becomes more abundant and is less worthless. So you have more dollars circulating in the world, chasing the same products, and the money becomes more diluted. Now, the best way that I found to get people to understand what inflation is the coffee analogy that I use all the time whenever I'm explaining what inflation is to anyone, or if I ever explain what inflation is with someone, I will most certainly use a coffee analogy, because again, analogies are a good way to get people to get an understanding of something that they may not automatically be able to grasp just with words. You give them an experience. But anyway, let's say that you work in an office somewhere, and somebody makes a pot of coffee, and the value of this coffee is the caffeine. The value of the coffee is actually the caffeine that's in it. So you drink the coffee for the caffeine, not necessarily for the coffee itself. Now, each cup of coffee has a certain amount of caffeine in it, regardless if it's a 1 ounce cup of coffee, or if it's a 5 ounce or a 10 ounce, whatever. it has a certain amount of caffeine in it. And that's the whole purpose of drinking a coffee. Now, let's say that somebody takes that coffee and they add, say, 10% water to it. Just take water and add 10% water to it. Well, that coffee now has been diluted by 10%. Now, it's still coffee, but now you have more volume. Unfortunately, you have more volume based off of them just adding water to the coffee, and with them adding water to the coffee, it just dilutes it by 10%. So now, the caffeine that you were after, you will get less caffeine in the same amount of coffee that you used to drinking before. So if you used to drinking a 10-ounce cup of coffee, well now, because the coffee's been diluted with water, now you're getting 10% less coffee, or 10% less caffeine in that coffee. And if you want to get the same caffeine as you were getting before, you'd have to drink an additional 10% to counteract them diluting 10% with water. Okay, let's say that person decides to add another 10% water to the coffee. Once again, it's still coffee. You just have more volume now, but it's even more diluted now. Now it's been diluted by 20%. So now the same rule applies, If you used to drinking a 10-ounce cup of coffee, now you have 10% less coffee that you were getting before. And if you want to get the same amount of caffeine that you were getting before, well, you have to drink an additional 20% of coffee, right? Then let's say that the person decides to add another 10% water to the coffee. Once again, it's still coffee, but it's diluted even more. Now it's diluted by 30% dilution. So same rule applies. It's the same coffee with the same caffeine, just that it's more diluted. And if you used to drinking a 10-ounce cup of coffee, if you want to get the same caffeine as you were getting before, you'd have to drink an additional 30%, and so on and so forth. We can go on and on with that. As they keep adding water to it, the same rules are going to apply. Now, give an understanding here is that the coffee is the money, and the caffeine is the value of that money. The water is the inflation in this analogy. The water is the inflation. And so every time the Federal Reserve adds more money to circulation, it's like adding more water to the coffee. And that means that the money that you have then becomes diluted and is worthless. That's why the prices of things go up. It's not that the prices of goods go up, but the value of your money goes down because they increase the money supply. And if you want to get have the same amount of values that you were getting before, well, just like drinking more coffee to get the same amount of caffeine, you have to earn more money to get the same value that you had before. So inflation basically, as they call it, is an invisible tax because the Federal Reserve does it, and they're taking value. They may not be taking money from you or you paying a fee or a tax to the government, but they're taking the value of your money by diluting it. And this is what inflation is. So inflation, again, is not when prices go up. Inflation is when prices, when the Federal Reserve increases the money supply, making the value of your dollar less, and they purchase less, which means that it takes more to buy the same goods as before. So, like I say, this is what inflation is. Again, it's not difficult to understand. A person with half a brain can understand this. Just so you get clarity on what it is. So now I'm going to come back again with a 2-part video, and this is on how the federal government actually gets money, to go more in depth in, how inflation impacts us and where does it come from and why does inflation happen. But anyway, y'all, as always, until next time.